Let me tell you the nastiest name that my partner ever called me. When we got to know each other, when we got to know each other's family histories, including stories about my father's terrific temper, particularly with things, Jim, my dad, would lose his mind in rage. The car would break down, the faucet would leak, the typewriter keys would get frozen, his glasses would break, anything mechanical or electrical would fail, and all of these would set him off into a storm of curse words and a tantrum more befitting a 3-year-old than a grown man. So when we had only been married a year or two, when something broke or wouldn't work or whatever, I don't even remember what it is now or what it was, suddenly there I was, channeling my father's rage, cursing and stomping, acting like a very big and very unpleasant baby. That's when Dee said the nasty thing. She said, "Calm down, Jim." Whoa. My ears still burn with rage at that. Calling me by my father's name. How dare she? How dare she remind me that in that moment I had become the thing, the person that I always swore I would never be. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. That's the beginning of our reading. That's the prophet Isaiah calling the leaders and people of Jerusalem by the nastiest name possible. Throughout most of the Old Testament, Jerusalem, the holy city, is contrasted with these two horrible cities despised by God, Sodom and Gomorrah. Those two cities transcended even their own ignoble history to become symbols of rebellion against God's justice. They are Moscow, structured to first serve the apparatchik, the party functionaries, and the billionaire oligarchs. They're Pyongyang, a city cowering in fear before a violent tyrant who wallows in access while the people starve. They are the worst places you can imagine, dwelling places of tyrant and dictators. But Jerusalem, God's place of peace, the holy city, the city of David, the house of God's own temple, was the opposite of Sodom and Gomorrah. As unholy as those cities were, that's how holy Jerusalem was. But with verse 10, Isaiah does the unthinkable. He calls the holy city by the names of the unholy cities. Washington, D.C. is now just another Moscow, just another Pyongyang. The corruption is struck at the root and seeped all the way through. Jerusalem has come face to face with God, and God is repulsed by what they've become. Of course, Jerusalem's primary claim to holiness is rooted in the temple, the place where God's presence is invoked through worship, through priestly offerings of communion, sacrifice, burnt offerings, blood of bulls, lambs, and goats, all had up to now been accepted, but now Isaiah tells us they are rejected by God. God doesn't need them. God doesn't want them. God won't accept them. God rejects them because Israel's gestures of worship are no longer vehicles for serious relationship. They're dishonest. They're a charade. What Isaiah here proclaims so dramatically, Jesus restates more succinctly when he says, if you are bringing your gift to the altar and there you realize that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift at the altar. And first go and be reconciled with your brother or sister. Then come back and offer your gift. Echoing Isaiah, he reminds us that the practice of worship must first be rooted in justice, or it's unacceptable to God. Again, imagine this in modern national terms. Washington, D.C. takes great pride in its symbols of national identity, flags and anthems and uniforms, granite memorials and glass-encased proclamations of rights and liberties, but without justice, without free exercise of those liberties and rights, without real honor afforded those who served. Those symbols are abhorrent. They're reminders of what we are not, rather than what we are. Without a nation that is truly a land of the free, without liberty and justice for all, then the songs and the pledges and the proclamations ring hollow. They strike a sour note. There was a time in liberal Protestantism when the rejection of cultic worship by the prophet, here in Isaiah, was interpreted to mean that God didn't approve of high liturgical sacramental churches. Read Catholics. So priests were replaced with pastors, wrote liturgies with worships open to the structure provided by the Spirit, bishops with church boards, Gothic cathedrals with plain meeting houses. Partly out of that understanding is why we shed our robes for the summer as a reminder that we're not priests, we pastors of this church, we're people chosen by the congregation to serve a special role. That would placate God, they thought, to just reorder themselves to eliminate these symbols of priestly practice. But if we read on to verse 1 of chapter 2, low church practices fare no better in this indictment by Isaiah, because God will not hear prayers from them as well. It's not a particularly priestly or religious practice that's rejected by God. It's rather every effort at communion that is rooted in pretense, dishonesty, and disobedience. It's hard to imagine a more complete a rejection of God's people than what we read here in Isaiah. God is finished with this people. God has had enough. God will not look. God will not listen. God will not attend. God will not respond. The people are now fully on their own without God. The end of verse 15 sounds like a final termination. Divorce papers have been served, signed, and finalized by the court. Like me, that may suit your mood right now. There may be things about Christianity, about church practice, about our nation's practice that make you despair, that make you think we should be too ashamed to face God right now, because what God sees in us would not make God happy or proud. But here's the thing about the prophet Isaiah. He will never fully give up on hope. He believes that there is always a pathway back to God. And in this passage, the pathway takes two forms. First, Israel must engage in a ritual purification. The whole people must wash like David did in Psalm 51. And what this means is they have to turn their backs on what they have become and remember again what they were born to be. Second, social relationships must change with justice and mercy shown to the oppressed, the orphan, and the widow. This triad, the oppressed, the orphan, and the widow, is not meant to be exhaustive in the Old Testament. It's used again and again to refer to all of those in the community or on the borders of the community who are weak, vulnerable, without an advocate, subject to political exclusion and economic oppression. Put these two together, and Isaiah is not telling the people to give up on worship, but to realign their worship, their sense of the holy, with justice, with loving care of the neighbor. So I came across a remarkable quote this past week. It came from way back in 1976 from Edward Abbey, environmentalist, essayist, and activist, reminding his like-minded audience to keep their sense of balance and harmony between these concepts of holiness and justice. He uses his own words. "Do not burn yourself out," he said. "Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic, Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It's even more important to enjoy it while you can. So get out there and hunt and fish and mess around with your friends, encounter the grizz, bag the peaks, run the rivers, breathe deep that yet sweet and lucid air, sit quietly for a while and contemplate the precious stillness, that lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Balance, holiness, and justice. One flows out from the other, it seems to me. Following the lead of Edward Abbey, I might believe the prophet Isaiah would tell us this: remember to enjoy God even as you serve God. Breathe in grace, for it is the stuff from which generosity is born. Live in joy, for it is close cousin to compassion. Let prayer restore your soul and beauty bless your spirit. Loving God is serving people, and it is through serving people that you will fall in love again with God. That's the balance that Isaiah is calling for. And here's the challenge. Here's the challenge that Isaiah issues for us religious folk. He invites us to think for a moment and experience our liturgy through the eyes of those who have been oppressed, ignored, or abandoned. What do our hymns sound like to someone who lives on the brink of destitution? Do our prayers evoke anger in the woman who can barely feed her children in the week between our services? Does the hope that we preach sound hollow to a child who does not feel safe in her own neighborhood or in his own home? One of our sister churches out east on a recent Sunday morning was filling up before the service began. The ushers were kept hopping as more and more of the congregation showed up for worship. Chairs were set up in the aisle, in the front and in the back of the sanctuary, until every chair had been set up and every chair was filled as the bell rang for worship. And just before the pastors were about to lead the call of worship from the back and then process up the aisle, one more person showed up. He was wearing motorcycle leathers. He was sporting numerous tattoos. He was sprouting metal rings and studs in ears, nose, and tongue. Looked around the sanctuary, and he saw that there were 2 empty chairs left. So he strolled down the aisle to the amazed stares of the other worshipers. He climbed up the stairs to the chancel, and he sat down in one of the 2 chairs set aside for the pastors. There was a kind of silent gasp, followed by a pregnant pause, as everyone in the sanctuary wondered what would come next. Well, then up the aisle came the old head usher of the church, gray-haired, walking with the kind of sway that comes from 75-year-old hips. He climbed up the chancel steps with some difficulty. He leaned into the young man sitting there and said, "You mind if I sit with you?" The young man shrugged, and the old man sat down right next to him. Isaiah would have been pleased. Amen.